I didn't move a muscle. I was afraid if I did, I wouldn't stop and I'd bolt like a frightened bunny. He ascended the stairs and probably saw my room, but it was nothing compared to what I was about to do. He'd understand that later, but for now, he was downstairs again, still searching and coming up with nothing but empty rooms. My breathing was steady, which surprised me. It didn't match the anxiety that was slowly creeping into my chest, as his footsteps finally paused outside the study door. When he opened it and entered, I heard a faint gasp, and his hands searching the walls. When the room was finally illuminated and bathed in a soft light, I could hear the relief and irritation present in his voice, as he spoke.
Do you mind explaining what the hell happened upstairs? And where on earth is Emmett?
He asked while crossing the room. I wasn't going to answer either of these questions. Both involved Bella, and if I thought about her I'd chicken the fuck out. No more of that. So I remained silent, and still, as he came into my view across the desk, and took his seat.
Good God, Edward,
he breathed as his gaze met my face, and he rose from his seat in alarm.
What happened to you?
His wide eyes scrutinized my face, and I had somehow forgotten about that. I idly wondered how bad I looked. My girl could really rough a motherfucker up. It was one more question that I couldn't answer, and I watched him lower his body back into the chair, as he hedged.
Did you get into a fight?
Like he'd ever believe me if I could tell him. I doubted it.
Would you please say something?
He eventually ordered, and his voice was laced with desperation and alarm as I decided it was now or never. I opened my mouth to mutter the words that I had been rehearsing in my head for the last 2 hours, but all that emerged was a raspy, "I need your help." That wasn't necessarily a lie or anything, but it wasn't what I wanted it to be. What did I want? Fucking violence and the gasp of the crowd. I was beginning to feel the reluctance of continuing on this path, and I battled to fight it back. Carlyle's eyes widened for a brief moment, before he visibly forced an expression of neutrality. I imagined he had wanted to hear those words for quite some time.
Anything, just tell me what you need,
he said with a staggering amount of conviction. His sincerity brought me a pang of guilt that made me swallow thickly as my hand twitched against the leather armrest. Why should I feel guilty? I'm used to myself. I needed Bella for the last 3 months, and where the fuck was his sincerity then? I kept building cases against Carlyle in my mind, to make what I was about to do easier, and I could see his expression growing skeptical and cautious as the seconds passed. Emmett, I began, and paused to clear my throat because it was gravelly from screaming and crying like a little bitch. His brows furrowed at the mention of my brother, but he remained silent, as he waited for me to continue. I'm not sure what I looked like on the outside, but on the inside I was fighting to keep this ridiculously calm exterior, and praying like hell that I was succeeding. I want what you did for Emmett, I finished, and watched the emotions flash across his face. First, confusion and curiosity, and then calculation, as he struggled to find the meaning of the statement without forcing me to elaborate, which I was thankful for. I could discern the exact second he finally understood what I meant, because his face lost all its color. His head began shaking slowly, as if involuntarily.
I don't know if that's such a good idea, Edward.
His strangled voice sounded bleeding, and I watched his fingers on the desk clasp and unclasp in an anxious gesture. Are you refusing? I asked flatly as I watched his hands, and I was secretly hoping he would say yes. If he refused me, and I couldn't go through with it, then it wouldn't be my fear that stopped me, it would just be another way for Carlyle to control me. I could live with that.
No,
he whispered softly after a long moment in defeat, and my stomach sank. The one time I needed him to go against me, he didn't. So fucking typical. His hands left the desk, and I couldn't meet his gaze as they began flipping through his keyring. He used a little golden key to unlock one of his drawers, and when the yellow manila folder met the dark wood of the desk, my mouth went bone dry. It looked so unassuming and innocuous. Just a pale yellow folder. I didn't know what I was expecting as I tentatively leaned forward in my seat, and eyed it dubiously. Maybe a black box with barbed wire and chrome spikes, or some shit. It would have been more appropriate than this little yellow folder. I reached for it with a dry swallow, that made my throat ache, and handled it as if it were the black box I had expected. I didn't open it. Carlyle's gaze was fixed on the folder as I set it in my lap. The look of pain and defeat etched across his features was almost painful to look at, and more than a little puzzling. It was an easy assumption for me to make, that he had wanted this shit for years now. Wordlessly, he rose from his seat, and traveled to the cabinet across the room, that held his medical supplies. I didn't object, as he gathered various items, and kneeled at my side, to inspect the bell-inflicted bite wound, on my neck.
This could get infected,
he whispered sadly, and I sat unflinching, as he cleaned it carefully, the yellow folder burning holes into my hands as I held it limply in my lap. No more words were exchanged.
Bella's point of view. It was a little odd how three people could manage to have an entire conversation with their eyes alone, and somehow understand everything the other person was attempting to convey. This was Alice, Emmett, and I, when Esme came home at 9. She leaned her elbows on the island, picking at the leftover meal I had cooked for Emmett and Alice, while she had been working late, and the room was entirely silent. It wasn't an eerie or uncomfortable silence, but more like the calm after the storm kind of silence. Maybe Esme was intuitive about this type of silence, because she tossed me a small grin, and asked, "Is everything okay?" There's that okay word again. I nodded, and attempted a forced smile which only made her more curious about the tense atmosphere of the room. Then she began covertly grilling Emmett and Alice for details of their day. Emmett sent Alice a glance that clearly showed his anxiety overlined to her, and Alice offered my panicked expression an easing smile, while she attempted to distract Esme with her AP History practice test grade. Emmett gazed at me apologetically, and I smiled in thanks as Alice stole the show, and performed flawlessly. Esme didn't have a clue what was going on. The call from the school about my abrupt disappearance was more or less inevitable, but it was obvious she hadn't received it yet, because she looked unusually chipper. Yes, chipper. Ever since the evening of Edward's birthday she had been withdrawn and sullen, so seeing her chipper was a rather big deal for Alice and me. I might have shown more interest, but my head was somewhere else entirely, mostly next door with Edward, and I was tossing Emmett the occasional glare, because he shouldn't be here with me. Edward was over there all alone, save for Carlyle, of whom I had serious doubts of being anything but a nuisance to Edward given the state I'd left his house in. The all-consuming guilt of my actions once again swelled within me as I whipped my cookie dough, and blocked out the voices behind me. I couldn't find the energy to pretend everything was okay, and I certainly couldn't handle the explosion from Esme, when she learned about my skipping class. To go see Edward. To victimize Edward. To have sex with Edward. Before she finally excused herself from the kitchen, she came to my side, and whispered low in my ear, "It's too late to do it this evening, but tomorrow you and I are going to have a discussion." My whole body froze, the cookie sheet only half filled with the desecrated Marzipan delicacies, as I realized my original assumption was clearly wrong. She knew. She must have known, and this discussion was going to be so unpleasant that it had to wait until morning. I listened to her exit the kitchen without meeting her gaze. She would have surely seen the panic in my eyes, and I was positive that was her intention all along. Making me wait and stew in my anxiety until she decided to punish me further. Could this day get any worse? The tense atmosphere of the room seemed to escalate after she left, and the three of us did not speak as we waited for the cookies to bake. Alice asked me about the afternoon's events only once before realizing that it wasn't something I was willing to discuss just yet. Emmett knew. That much was obvious from the second he walked through the door, and used his big brown eyes to scan every inch of my visible skin. He had made himself comfortable, and refused to leave for some reason unknown to me, so I simply made him dinner, and welcomed the distraction. I was wondering how long he could possibly stay. We were all three sitting at the dark granite counter island in our respective stools, Emmett farthest away from me on the end, and Alice at my side, fidgeting uselessly with clear Ziploc bags and spatulas, when three things occurred simultaneously. First, the timer buzzed loudly on the stovetop. the cookies were done baking. Second, as my cell phone went off in her purse beside the microwave, a grating ringtone program specifically to Dr. Cullen. Finally, there were 3 sharp and loud raps on the front door, that could be heard even in the kitchen over the timer, and the cell phone. The silence was so abruptly damaged that it made me flinch as I sprinted to the stove and quickly turned off the timer and the oven. As my cell phone kept ringing as she tended to the visitors at the front door, and I narrowed my eyes at her black purse in annoyance before she finally raced into the kitchen to answer it. She was slightly out of breath as she answered Dr. Cullen's call with a smile and relaxed against the counter. I watched in a stealth curiosity and returned to my seat as they spoke, assuming that Edward had been caught skipping class too, and growing horrified at the notion of him being in more trouble. As Dr. Cullen spoke, as my smile slowly fell and her eyes immediately darted to mine and widened. Shit. I quickly shifted my gaze to my lap, fingering the hem of my hoodie, and wishing there was a hole nearby for me to crawl into and die. The appalled and heartbroken expression on Esme's face must have meant that they knew everything. Before I could even muster up the appropriate level of alarm, 2 figures entered the kitchen. I was taken aback as Jasper and Rosalie met my shocked gaze with smiles and gracefully strode to their partners' sides. My brows furrowed in confusion as I fought to pay attention to everything surrounding me. Right now? Right now? Can't it wait until? Esme paused and bit on the inside of her cheek absently as she held the phone to her ear. Should I do it? She whispered, and I suddenly noticed Jasper and Rosalie speaking lowly into Alice and Emmett's ears. The hell is going on? I tuned Esme out to focus on the exchange between my 4 friends and grew alarmed as Alice's face paled and she met my gaze. Emmett didn't seem as affected by whatever Rose told him, and she took a seat at his side, smiling at me warmly. "Oh, cookies!" she exclaimed brightly, and smelled the air. "Almond, right?" she asked while lacing her arm through Emmett's, one blonde brow quirked up in curiosity. This was weird. Rosalie never gave a crap about cookies. I had just opened my mouth to panic more verbally when Esme snapped her phone shut and turned to me. Her eyes briefly connected to everyone else's and I felt like I was being left out of some huge secret. It was pissing me off. "Well, I think that Esme began, then paused to shake her head, as if she needed to start over. "What I mean is that maybe," she trailed off, and the other 4 people in the room were looking everywhere but at me. With a sigh, Esme walked behind me and grasped my shoulders, silently asking me to leave the stool. I obeyed, and when she turned me around and led me to the kitchen window, I became impossibly more confused. Before I could grow annoyed and ask her what the hell was going on, my eyes adjusted to the darkness of the backyard, and I could clearly make out a form in the gazebo. "Go," was all she said, and I didn't wait for any further indication of allowance as I sprung for the door and swung it open. It was too good to be true, and somewhere in the back of my mind I realized this as I crossed the yard. Esme would have never let me leave the house so late to see Edward, of all people, but I was trying to avoid a nagging sensation of foreboding as I approached the gazebo. Edward was sitting on his side of the bench as I hesitantly took mine. He was wearing his jacket, and he offered me a small smile as he folded his arms on the table, laying his cheek on his arms facing me. He was tired, and it showed. I was thankful for the darkness of night, because I couldn't see his injuries. I stared at him anxiously as he fixed his gaze to the wooden table. I was dying to close the distance between us, but I knew I couldn't, so I mimicked his pose and laid my cheek on my arms. Mostly, I felt stupid, and the sounds of the river were lulling me into a far too relaxed state given the circumstances.
Emmett once had a really disgusting infatuation with reggae.
He abruptly whispered, meeting my gaze and grinning crookedly. Avoidance. It was frustrating. And I wasn't in the mood to play games. But if this was what Edward needed for now, then I would give it to him. I returned his grin tightly. "Reggae music isn't so bad," I defended quietly with a shrug, while I memorized the lines of his face in the darkness. He rolled his eyes and began picking at the wood with his fingers.
The music I could stand, but that fucker had to wear those ugly rain